Welcome back. We're going to talk about stating the conclusion to a hypothesis test. Now, we've said that the two outcomes to a hypothesis test are to reject the null hypothesis or to fail to reject the null hypothesis. But note that we never say that we accept the null hypothesis, and this is because we're never able to prove that the null is true. Instead, we say that we fail to reject the null. And again, this is just like in our court system. In a trial, we assume that the defendant is innocent, so we can think of this as our null hypothesis. If there's strong evidence against this assumption, then we conclude that he's guilty. But if there's not strong evidence that he's guilty, then all we can say is that he's not guilty. Notice that we don't conclude that he's innocent. We don't prove or conclude that our assumption of innocence, like our null hypothesis, is true. So, at the end of a hypothesis test, you're going to arrive at one of two conclusions. Either you're going to reject the null hypothesis and conclude the alternative, in which case you're going to say that there is sufficient evidence for the claim in the alternative hypothesis, or you're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis, in which case you're going to say that there is not sufficient evidence for the claim in the alternative. So now let's look at our cell phone example. Now our null hypothesis is HO mu equals 3.25. That is, the mean length of calls on cell phones is 3.25 minutes. And our alternative is H1. The mean length of calls is greater than 3.25 minutes. Now, suppose the sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis should be rejected. How do we state our conclusion? We're going to say there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the mean length of calls on cell phones is greater than 3.25 minutes. But now, suppose the sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis should not be rejected. Now we'll say there is not sufficient evidence to conclude that the mean length of calls on cell phones is greater than 3.25 minutes. Notice that we don't conclude that the mean is 3.25. That's what we're assuming. But what we're saying is that there is not sufficient evidence to conclude the mean length of calls is greater than 3.25 minutes.